All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell. This is the X Zone. We're coming to you from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Worldwide toll-free, 1-800-610-7035. Email xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. On all social media sites, X Zone Radio TV, and our main website, www.xzoneradiotv.com. This hour, we're going to be talking about Ebola. We're going to be talking to Major Dr. Doug Rokke, who is no stranger to the X Zone Nation. He is an expert, and it's always a great pleasure having you with us, Doug. Usually you and I talk about depleted uranium, but you contacted us this morning, said we had to talk about it. We just did some shuffling of guests around because when Doug Rokke contacts us, I know it's important. So welcome to the show, Doug.
Thank you very much, Rob.
It's no secret that Ebola is causing panic around the world with patient zero, as he was called, in Texas, to now a couple of nurses in Spain. There have been people that are being tested in Canada, in the United Kingdom, France. It seems that it's starting to gallop, Doug, and as an expert on biological weapons as well as depleted uranium, what's the story behind the story, Doug?
Well, I think the story behind the story, and the thing that's most frightening to me, is we're going to go back to before Desert Storm. Mm-hmm. We knew that Iraq had all the chemical and biological weapons prior to Desert Storm in 1990, again because the United States military and Great Britain, Germany, France, and even the Soviet Union shipped the chemical and biological weapons to Iraq for use on the Iraqis, the Kurds, and Iranians. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, when we all knew we were going to war, we found out, my God, nobody's prepared. They're not prepared. The U.S. military wasn't prepared. None of the military services of any of the coalition nations were prepared. Saudi Arabia definitely wasn't prepared. And as a consequence, it got real scary, and so they had to form Bowers Raiders, and I became a member of that team. And we had to develop all of the protocols on how do we handle chemical and biological casualties, how do we handle contaminated casualties, how do we handle contagious casualties, what are we going to do, how do we contain this, because once the genie's out of the bottle, man, it's like what's happening, there's just a flood and it keeps going and going and going. So from that, we did in Desert Storm, and we taught literally thousands of people. We put things in place. And as you know, and as history has proven, the warnings we had about the health and environmental effects of all this stuff have came completely true. Then we went to Operation Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom, and we did the same thing again. And now we got 1.5 million casualties from there. And it's an ongoing thing where individuals cannot get prompt and optimal medical care. I was fighting it for it again my last few days myself, and fighting it for the members of my team, and fighting it for everybody else, and it's still broken. So, we're looking at the same thing. So when they say they're prepared to deal with something, we have to look at the reality of the inside. Were they prepared before? Has anything happened to change it? What happened to the continuing medical education in this time being? After Desert Storm, and especially after 9/11, we went into a high teaching mode. But for 10 years, 12 years now, we haven't done anything. There's been no teaching. There's been no preparation. There's been no facilities made capable of handling anything like this. And now all of a sudden, here we go again. Now what do we do?
With over 3,000 members of the services in the United States going over to West Africa, are they trained well enough to be protected from the Ebola strain of virus, Doug?
They're sending over the members of the 101st to Port Campbell, Kentucky. Now, I personally took those individuals and the different work with them over the years. Mm-hmm. Again, whether Desert Storm, after Desert Storm, and then we were with the 101st when we got ready to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom, and they deployed from Fort Polk, and I came back to pack my bag, but I was too sick already. No, they're not. You can't take soldiers that have limited education, don't have any chemical, biological mm-hmm. knowledge, they don't have any medical knowledge, and put them into an environment like this because, first off, they don't know the culture, they don't speak the language, and what are they going to do? I mean, stand around there and look? I mean, what is necessary, and this is the thing that frightens me, and this is the thing that should frighten everybody in the world. When we first put together this stuff, the key thing is total isolation. In other words, you establish a defensive biological perimeter from which nobody exits and nobody enters without complete permission.
All right, Doug, we're going to have
establish that, have to work from there.
All right, Doug, stand by. We've got to take our 2-minute commercial break. X-Zone Nation, Dr. Doug Rokke is my special guest this hour. We're talking about Ebola. My name is Rob McConnell. This is the X-Zone. We'll be back on the other side of this 2-minute break. Don't go away. The United States is sending over 3,000 servicemen to help build hospitals, help build containment areas, as well as help with the logistics. Major Dr. Doug Rokke is my special guest. We've had the pleasure of talking to Doug several times over the years. He's a good friend of the X-Zone Nation. In the past, we've talked to Doug about depleted uranium, biological hazards. We've talked about the Gulf Wars. And Doug, I never thought in a million years you and I would be talking about Ebola and the threat that it is putting the entire world in. Now, I've got to ask you a question.
It's pretty frightening because, Ebola showed up in 1976, 74, 75, 76. And again, a hemorrhagic fever. Now, it's a virus. It's a virus. We have to understand there are no medications. There are no drugs known that can counter viruses. That's the problem we run into all over the world. If you've got some type of bacterial infection, yeah, you can do that. But again, even those things start to mutate. What we have found today with the bacterial infections, we don't have antibiotics to find them. Well, the same thing with viruses, and I'm going to go back way in history, again, and looking at all this stuff, and again, the military applications and all this stuff, this is where this stuff was developed and used the first time, and it continues to be used. So you just end up with a nightmare. Now, in this case here with Ebola, again, you don't know where it's going to come from. You don't know how it's going to get you. You've got all the body fluids, any fluids that can get and transfer from the body onto the next person. And that means it can come from feces, it can come from urine, it can come from sweat, it can come from, take your, cold weather's turning in, take and breathe onto the window, and you'll see the condensation of the vapor in the mist. Well, that's, the flu and the cold and everything, everybody knows that's in that. So, again, it's coming all over the place. The horrible thing about Ebola, and when I look at the CDC and everything I learned, the incubation period is just weird as can be, anywhere from 2 to 6 to 21 days, maybe a lot of 5 to 8 days. But the person can be completely healthy and doing well, and you screen them and they look like they're fine, and 24 hours later they're dying. And you have no way to control it. And so what frightened me and what I've been trying to get everything together, trying to get our team back together, and the sad part is the team of extroverts that did all this stuff before, too many are dead or too many are sick, and we're all retired, and nobody wants to listen to old retired, has-beens or whatever you have. So now you've got a problem. When they didn't establish immediately a perimeter of control, and now allowed to continue without establishing a perimeter of control, it dooms to failure because you can't control it once the genie is out of the bottle and starts transferring. And then the inadequate decontamination modes allow mutations to take place. In other words, this stuff is growing in intensity and growing in strength, and how are you going to stop it now?
That's scary. It's really scary. What I've done, Doug, is I've got a petition online at www.stopEbolaPetition.com, and I'm petitioning the Canadian government, because we're based up here in Canada, to deny entry into Canada anyone from any country in Africa or any other country anywhere where there are suspected cases of Ebola or confirmed cases of Ebola. They should be put into a quarantined area for at least 21 days and monitored at the end of the 21 days. If they still show no sign of infection, let them back into the country. And I've been called a racist because of this.
Well, yeah, but that quarantine has to happen before they leave that other nation. You can't have somebody coming into this nation. They're flying on the aircraft and flying all over the world, and you've got multiple connections in and out of airports and in and out of stuff, throwing spit and urine and feces and God knows and snot and everything all over the place. So once you leave that foreign country to come here at this time, I mean, what it has to have happen is complete isolation of Africa in these areas where there's no travel out of that area whatsoever. Now, the medical authorities obviously are going to have to go in and try to establish a facility. The problem you run into, and this comes back to what the problem we had during Desert Storm and with everything else, we put the plans together. You can't take a tent or anything like this as a facility that has a porous material, of any porous materials, and use that, because once the contamination gets in the porous material, there's no way to clean it or decontaminate it. And all these tent ideas where they said, well, we'll take a DepMeds facility for the U.S. military, well, that's a tent. That thing's not made for chemical or biological casualties at all. That's why we established the incredible levels of decontamination way away from any hospital or medical treatment facility or anything where you're going to have people. In other words, you're decontaminating them in an area way away where you don't have to worry about it, and then you have to clean that up after you decontaminate it because you can't just leave it there. And there's no plans like this. Right now they're bringing a casualty into the hospital, and somehow they're going to decontaminate it in the hospital without contaminating the hospital. And then they're going to put, and I pulled up the stuff, they're going to put this PPE suits that I call, spit bags, because they won't do anything. And then they get it on there. Now, how are they going to get out of those things without contaminating everything else? And then they contaminate the area around them, and now they got to decontaminate there. So what you got is a snowball in hell. It's bad. It's horrible, and everybody forgot the simplest thing: containment at the source, treatment at the source. But then you run into the problem: how do you have hygiene in an area where you don't have water, sanitation, you don't have anything in place?
So how do we do it, Doug? There's got to be a solution. Now, I understand that the quarantining of the area, a fixed quarantine, has to be done. I agree 100%. When it comes to...
Well, what I think we need to do is go back to the thing where they completely stop all traffic in and out of the affected areas, period, end of story. And you can't move and you can't leave, and it doesn't matter until this is all under control. And then once they do that, you establish what we'd call the biological perimeter. In other words, this is where we know the known health effects are and the contamination is. And when I speak contamination, I'm speaking all of the body fluids and everything else, so this is spread all over the place. Then we got to find out what that is. Now, as people get separated that are healthy from those that are not healthy, you can separate in that biocontainment area to establish a safe zone, and you know that area is clean. So now as you start getting people healthy or getting people treated or reduce the cross-transfer of infection, then you can reduce your biocontainment area until such time as we eliminate it. But what you have a problem there is a problem we ran into Desert Storm with what we call night soil. You got all the feces and urine being transferred all over the place and no way to control it, and you don't have sanitation facilities that can handle contaminated stuff. It can't go through a standard facility because some of these bugs, you get them in growing into the other ones, and they're just going to grow like mad. So we don't know what's going to happen to this stuff and how it gets mutated.
As a member of the military, would you have sent U.S. troops over to West Africa to work on this, on the containment or the humanitarian efforts to assist in the Ebola crisis?
No, that's criminal because they don't have the capability, the knowledge to take care of it or do it. There were only a handful of us that were ever trained to do this, and then we trained probably 1,500 people during Desert Storm to even a marginal level, but still they were inadequately trained and inadequately equipped because, as we've discussed and history has proven now, we held off the beginning of the ground war during Operation Desert Storm because we didn't have the medical capabilities in place. We didn't have the decontamination capabilities in place. We didn't have anything in place. And we were horrified because we knew what they had. I mean, they had weaponized anthrax because Fort Detrick sent it to them. They had all of these incredible biological weapons. And we did treat, I mean, I had a whole unit, the 801st MP unit that's co-located with O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. They came out and hit the biological landmines, Bacillus globegi, that were planted there, and they all went down. Now, with Bacillus globegi, like with this, the only thing you have is supportive measures. In other words, you have to have an awful lot of IVs to maintain hydration. You have to be able to maintain all of your electrolytes, and you have to be able to maintain airway and provide oxygen and breathing. Well, where is this going to come from, and how are they going to do it? I mean, you get into a hospital in an ICU, they might have 5 or 10 beds where they can do this in. They don't have the beds where they're going to do 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 people at a time.
In plain English, we're not ready for it.
No, we're not. We never have been, and that's the frightening thing, and that's why I got so scared, and my other team members that I've spoken to were so scared, because the containment has been breached, and the political decisions for the same thing which you cited, racism, we can't stop them from traveling, has now doomed everybody around. So once it got there, we know it's in Spain, we know it's in Dallas, Texas, we know it's in Nebraska. The containment at those areas has to be huge. Now, in Dallas, Texas, we still don't know what's going to happen. We know the guy is dead. We know he contaminated. We know he was in the community. That we know that these fools turned him away from the ER when he went for help. But the problem you run into, and this is the problem we had during Desert Storm when we had to put this together, you can't take a sick patient like this into a standard ER because the ER is trashed. And how do you decontaminate that ER and all the equipment? We found out you couldn't. So when you look at the Medical Management, Chemical and Biological Casualties Handbook for the U.S. military and NATO and Canadians, as I said, adopted the whole thing because they worked right with me, worked with us. You're putting it out there basically in an area the size of 2 football fields, and you've got everything set together where you bring in, and the people that are expecting are going to die, you don't waste your time on. That's the horrible part, because when you get into this stuff, we have to do what's called reverse triage. In other words, I'm not going to waste resources on people that we know are going to die right away when I can try and save some other ones that haven't come down with it yet or have limited.
Doug, let me ask you this. You just brought up something very interesting, because there's a lot of controversy in the media. The Reverend Jesse Jackson is also saying that Duncan or patient 0 did not receive the same treatment as the NBC cameraman and some, I forget who the other person was, by getting either these new drugs or a blood transfer. Was this because, in your opinion, that they knew that Duncan was going to die and there was no sense doing anything except making him comfortable?
Well, when you get to the extent as sick as he was, and I'm not a doctor and I wasn't there, so I don't know, but as sick as he was, there's not a whole lot you can do. Your kidneys are shutting down, your heart is shutting down, your liver is shutting down. We don't have the medical capability to do this. This is what's horrifying about chemical and biological weapons. This is what's horrifying about depleted uranium. I mean, we still got individuals that are dying from these exposures, and they're still being denied care.
All right, Dougie.
We got one right here in Illinois that just, his mother called me, absolutely exposed to depleted uranium. He absolutely did not get the care, and he absolutely died. Denied care from the VA in Illinois.
Doug, I've got to take my news break. Stand by. X Zone Nation, I'll be back on the other side of this break with Dr. Doug Rokke here in the X Zone. Don't go away. Dr. Doug Rokke is my special guest this hour, X Zone Nation. We've had Doug on the show many times. He's a good friend of the X Zone. We've talked to Doug in the past about depleted uranium, biological warfare. We've talked to Doug about Oh my gosh, so many things pertaining to the wars in the Middle East, and now we're talking to Doug about Ebola. And something that really bothers me, Doug, and I haven't heard very many people talk about it. If we know that Ebola is spread by bodily fluids, if a member of ISIS or a number of people within the ISIS organization were able to infect themselves with Ebola, beat the incubation period back to the United States, come down with a full-blown case of Ebola and start going through the shopping centers, downtown areas, sneezing, cahooting, this would turn them into biological weapons, terrorist weapons.
Yeah, it sure is. But, I mean, you don't have to look at ISIS. I mean, there's so many groups and organizations in Africa that are so irritated at the U.S. and Western intervention in their nations that it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever if they could do that. I mean, this comes out of the same thing. I mean, when we look at our borders, the borders are porous. When we look at security on the borders and security for health effects, it's non-existent. Look at what happened because of the porous borders just with the tuberculosis. We had tuberculosis cured and eliminated, and now it's in epidemic proportions again in certain populations and all this other stuff. So we're getting diseases that are coming back in. Now, the whole idea when they're going to do screening, well, the guy gets on the airport in the airplane, he flies over here, he's going to land there, and now he's landed at the airport, now he's going to come in there, and some guy that's, had maybe 2 hours of training is going to do medical screening, looking for a fever, headache, muscle pain, weakness, diarrhea, vomiting, stomach pain, or unexplained bleeding, okay? Mm-hmm. Well, the guy may or may not have it, because the guy could be sicker than blue blazes, but he could be anywhere instead from, you got an incubation period of 2 days to 21, most of them are 8 to 10 days, but he could be in any one of those periods, so it might not manifest itself until a few hours after he had been supposedly screened. Well, now that screening has failed, and it's all over creation, and the horrifying thing is, once you get the urine and the feces into the area coming in, they're, like you said, spitting all over the place, now what happens? And there's no way to contain it. I mean, that is the most frightening part about it. Now, the medical authorities, everything we know, I mean, you get a standard ambulance. Okay, the person's sick, the ambulance goes there. The ambulance picks them up, the EMTs pick them up. They don't have the equipment. They don't have the proper PPE to take care of themselves. They don't have the decontamination procedures. And then once that person gets in there and vomits and urines, hell, when a person is sick, and I've been in here just normal medical problems, the urine, the feces, and everything else from the people that are sick is all over the ambulance, so it's all over you. So now you've got it all over your place. Now, how are you going to get yourself clean? You can't decontaminate this stuff. One thing we learned with biologicals, the only way to really kill this stuff is you have to have high-temperature incineration, a medical incinerator. Now, the other stuff on place is what we take as superchlorine, HTH. You mix it up at about 80% available chlorine. In other words, it's a liquid paste of chlorine that's daubed on it and left there for 10 to 15 minutes to kill the bug. That's the only thing we found that worked. Soap and water ain't going to work. Right. I mean, spraying them off with little hose or taking like a garden sprayer and a little bit of water and spraying it on them. I mean, all this doing is causing this stuff to mutate and say, oh, you hit me with a little bit. Well, I'm going to come back at you stronger, and each time it gets worse and worse and worse. And then what you need to decontaminate it gets stronger and stronger and stronger until the point there ain't anything. Am I making sense here?
Yes, you are. You always do. You always do. But what you're saying is frightening, Doug. And, this is one of your greatest attributes is your honesty, my friend. And when I'm sitting here thinking about what I've heard on the various news sources, read on the different websites, you're painting a totally different picture. Like what you're saying is, no, we're not ready. You're not doing it right. Sending troops over is a mistake because they're not trained for this. Is it possible, Doug? Once again, I've been doing this show for 23 years, and I've talked to a lot of conspiracy people. Is it possible that sending the troops over to Africa, which is a lot closer to Syria than they are here, could be part of a bigger plan?
No, not at all. No. I mean, you know, I've heard all those conspiracy things all along, and all that's just as nonsense. I mean, we're just talking about horrific events and plain stupidity. People want to jump in and do something, and they don't know. The horrifying thing with most medical authorities and everybody, I mean, here in our area and all over the United States, we haven't done any effective training, which we call the 120 City program, in 10 to 12 years. We haven't done any effective training with medical and biological casualties for police and fire in 10 to 12 years. So now the people that we did give minimal training, and most we gave them was maybe 8 hours or maybe 2 or 3 days, and that we did both in the U.S. and Canada. I mean, you know, I found the name of the Canadian officers and guys that I worked with here a while ago, which was neat. But it's not in place. And so now the people that did have minimal training are no longer there, they're retired. Now the other individuals pick up whatever resources they have. They don't understand them. Because with chemical or biological, and especially this stuff, you have to have total awareness, then you have to have comprehension, then you have to be able to apply the stuff according to what you know and happen to see what happens. And then when it all changes, you've got to be automatically ready to transfer all your skills and everything you've learned into a new situation and make it happen different. And you've got to synthesize new solutions to old problems using things of all of your knowledge across all of the domains of knowledge. And I think that's when Bowers Raiders was put together originally. You know, we were EMTs, we're chemical, we're scientists, we're engineers. We had the whole domain covered, and we could communicate with each other, and we didn't worry about who was in charge and who wasn't in charge, or who had the MD or the PhD, who had the whatever. It was like, how do we get the problem solved, and how do we do it now? Because there ain't any other time to do it.
So are we too politically correct? Are we too cautious? Are we too free willing to put our power where our mouth is? And one thing that really bothers me, Doug, is after talking to you many times, we can't take care of the vets that are coming home now. God forbid, how are we going to take care of 300 members who may face contamination with Ebola?
They don't have any. They don't even have any treatment. I mean, when we look at the treatment, and I'm looking at the CDC reports, and again, I went in there and digging all this out because I had to review it, and I've done this before, and I've taught it and everything. The only thing you have, and this is what we found in Desert Storm with the biological casualties we treated, is incredible IV therapy. Okay, you have to have incredible levels of IVs. Now, the problem when you go to start an IV, you yourself are going to get contaminated with all the liquids in the blood and everything else from the IV. Now, you've got to be pumping them in there like mad. So if we get all these guys down, how many IVs you have, how many people can start an IV, and what we had a problem in combat is starting an IV in a combat or in a dirty situation in Africa or like this is not the same as trying to do it in the doctor's office. What we found out, and what I found out, especially when you've been exposed before and have problems, a super nurse or an anesthesiologist can't start an IV. I mean, that's what they found on me when I went to surgery. We can't start them on you. Why? Well, because of this is the previous damage that we had and how it affects everything. So the only medical care that you have totally available for this is, IV therapy and maintaining oxygen. At the same time, you maintain your electrolytes and try to treat all the other organ failures that are happening.
It seems then the only thing to do is to, like you were saying, have reverse triage. And, those who are able to be helped go one way, and those who can't be helped just are kept comfortable until it's time for them to go.
Yeah, because how much resources are you going to expend? But we have to come back to the same thing. And maybe it's too late. I hope it's not. We have to go to containment at the source. That's the only option. And this idea, well, they're still going to, as they talked about on the news here with the United States and Canada with the CDC and everybody working together, well, we're going to teach the guys and give them a 2-hour class and they can screen them as they come in. Well, it's too late. Once they left Africa and started traveling, that was the end of it. So it has to be total containment at the source. Then, yes, we can get facilities built over there. We're going to have to be facilities that can be cleaned up. In other words, they have to be non-porous surfaces and facilities that can be decontaminated and cleaned after the contaminated sick patient comes through, and to get them cleaned up. But then you have to worry about how do I decontaminate and clean all of my medical treatment personnel, and how do I take care of them? What do we do with sewage and sanitation? Where do we get the water? Where do we get all the IVs? I mean, when we had the 801st go down from Bacillus globegi coming out of the tap line at KKMC during Desert Storm, we didn't have enough IVs. We didn't have enough IVs at all available, and all we could do was drink water and flush water. It was like basically putting a water hose down your throat and flushing it out. You know, and it was horrific. And and that was only 50 people.
Wow.
Totally unprepared for 50 people with a Bacillus globegi, which what it causes is like dysentery. I mean, when it hit me, they put bags in both arms, squeezed bags into both arms and in both legs, and Lomotil and everything else, and it wasn't working.
Unbelievable. So how do we convince those in power, Doug, to contain it on the other side of the big pond, keep it in Africa until these people have passed a quarantine period?
Well, I'm not sure what the quarantine period is going to be, because one thing that I read here, and especially the whole thing, and this is the frightening part of it, even after the person has been cured, it says in the CDC and the World Health Organization it can still be passed by semen and everything else later on. So you've got the person is cured, and now it's passed again. Now, what is happening to this virus? How is this virus going to mutate? We think, the stuff I've read from biological research, we think that this thing came out of the apes, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And then it got transversed over the humans, and you can figure out how that happened if you want to think about it. And it's not nice, but that's part of reality.
Oh, my God, give me a fork. I want to pork my eyes out. Yeah, that's sick.
Yeah, well, welcome to reality. So, you know, we're looking at this. We know today, absolutely know today, the chemical and biological casualties generated from Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, the U.S. military alone, much less a coalition, cannot get effective, prompt, and optimal medical care. It has been a total travesty here in the United States, an entire, I mean, there's no way to describe how bad it is. And then when we look in these nations that are already sick and contaminated, I mean, when I get phone calls from Afghanistan, or I talk to science or doctors that are going in there to work with them in Afghanistan and Iraq, they're all sick. We know they're sick in Somalia. We know they're sick in the Balkans. We got people sick in Hawaii. We got people sick all over the place from these exposures. And there's no effective medical care. And nobody really cares, because the problem you run into is they don't want to think about it, talk about it, or distribute the information. For example, here in the central part of the United States, for the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, we have a thing that's in Vision 11. The Vision 11 director put out the medical guidelines for physicians years ago on everything what we call Gulf War illness. As of yesterday, my doctor had never seen it when they were providing me care. I've asked to give it to them to provide Medicare and everybody else, and they just don't want to do it because it's acknowledgement of the horrific effects of stuff that we did and we can't admit. Now, with Ebola, we don't know where it came from. We don't know how to control it. We don't know how long it's going to be there. We don't know how it's going to mutate. And we don't have any medical treatments for it. They can come up and say, well, we got all these miracle drugs and everything might work. We don't know if they're going to work. Maybe they got lucky in the ability to pump all the IVs and maintain the guy's electrolytes and maintain his oxygen at a given time. Every individual is different. Some, what we call a constituency of the body, some people can stand up and get hit by flu over and over and come out healthy. Another person gets a little dab and they're down for the count immediately.
This is scary stuff. In your opinion, Doug, and I'm just asking you for your opinion because you've done so much work and so much research in this, are we looking at more cases of Ebola being treated in the United States, and do you think there's a chance of an epidemic?
Yes. I wish I could say otherwise because they weren't sure today. They were scared that the deputy sheriffs down in Texas had came down with it. Yeah. They still don't know how much that guy down there exposed other people where it is. all the transfers and these guys flying through, all the people coming in, and they said, what's 100, 150, or 200 a day coming in. They don't know what's happened to them. They don't know where they go to. They themselves could think that they're totally healthy and be sick. You can be a carrier. The idea that you might have full-blown symptoms before it's going to come up, or, oh, I can identify them as carrier, is nonsense. Mm-hmm. We know from this stuff before you can be a carrier and not be really symptomatic, or not be picked up, oh, I just got the flu, I don't feel good, or I had too much to drink last night, had a headache, and bang.
It reminds me of the early days of the story behind Typhoid Mary, except we're talking about Ebola.
Typhoid fever, cholera, all of the same stuff. I mean, this is the early days of that stuff. Smallpox.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't that long when you and I were small, again in the 50s, mm-hmm. where the measles and the mumps and chickenpox, in order to do it, people were deliberately exposed in order to get immunity. Well, on this stuff, we don't think there's no knowledge of immunity really happening.
Doug,
they have an idea that there might be some stuff formed in here,
right.
Antibodies formed that got people that have come down with it. I don't think anybody knows, but when it mutates, then those antibiotics don't treat it.
Yeah, Doug, stand by, my friend. You and I have to take our final break for this hour. X-Zone Nation, Doug Rokke is our special guest. The director of the CDC is saying that Ebola is like the AIDS epidemic. That is scary. We'll be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away. X-Zone Nation, Dr. Doug Rokke is my special guest this hour. We're talking about Ebola, but we're telling you the truth about Ebola. Doug, let us say by some miracle, President Obama was to call you up and say, Doug Rokke, I want you to help us with this problem. What would you do, Doug?
Well, the very first thing is I would establish biocontainment in the affected areas where the people are all sick. In other words, prevent all further foot travel, vehicle travel, air travel. In other words, nobody goes in or out of that area where they're contaminated and known to be sick. Once we establish that, what we'll call a biological perimeter, then we have to recruit or whatever we're going to do, somehow get the medical resources necessary. That's going to have to be up to the doctors and the experts. But they have to remember then when they're going to a treatment facility, it has to be something where they can treat the casualties in, but they still can decontaminate that facility without getting cross-contaminated. Big problem we had in Desert Storm is they bring the casualties in, they're contaminated, and now they contaminate the facility and then bring the next casualty in that's not contaminated, and now they contaminate them. So you have into a problem. It's going to take incredible resources. Now, the big problem you have in Africa and the other ones is hygiene. Where do you have sewage and sanitation treatment? How do you get rid of all this stuff? Requires incredible resources and knowledge. Now, I think it can be done, but it has to start at the source. We have to have total biocontainment, total infection control, and then we have to understand that we have to have the proper PPE and not these little, wear a plastic suit that is useless. I mean, I can show you the photos when we wore these plastic suits and they didn't work. And the guys are dead now because they wore them and they didn't work. So again, it's common sense down there. The information's out there, but nobody's sharing it. The information's been taught, but nobody's been sharing it. The information's been available, but nobody's sharing it. And it's the political will and everything, as you mentioned from the get-go. What do I need to do to contain this? In other words, I got to stop complete movement in and out of the area, and then I got to treat it where it is. And as I get people cured, I can reduce the biological containment perimeter until I eliminate it.
Doug, where does FEMA fit into all this? Isn't FEMA supposed to be working with the CDC on the control of this? Isn't it Federal Emergency Management?
Well, yeah, when we put the original programs together for 120 city, we had all of the different groups working together. But again, you came in, we got in the turf wars. This is my turf. This is your turf. No, I can't do this. You can do this. No, this is your responsibility. No, this is mine. No, it's nobody's responsibility. And so as a consequence, it's turned into a disaster because team effort doesn't exist. Everybody has their turf, and nobody wants to give it up, and nobody wants to admit when they're wrong.
So
and when they're right, nobody wants to use it. And that's why it's turned into a disaster for Gulf War illness and all the things treating and everything all over the world now from the military operations and military contamination.
One quick question, Doug. We're running out of time really fast. I've got about 30 seconds. Have the conditions with the VA improved?
Absolutely not. They're getting worse by the day because they haven't made the conscious decision yet to make the political decision to acknowledge the health and environmental effects of all this stuff and just provide the prompt and optimal medical care. And when the people screw up, admit they screwed up and take care of it. There's no accountability for what went wrong or the people that caused the problems, and there's still no sharing of all the information necessary to optimize medical care. And that's what's happening with Ebola.
Doug Rokke, thank you so much for joining us, Doug. Once again, if there's anything that you need to get out to the public, you let me know. We'll get you on as soon as we can.
God bless you, Rob. Thank you.
God bless you, Doug Rokke, and God bless all of our members of the armed forces and armed services around the world. I'll be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news at 6.5 minutes past the top of the hour as the X Zone continues right here from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. My name is Rob McConnell. I'll be back. Don't go away.